Hello and welcome to video number 6, Sensing the Body, Performing Gender and Sexuality. Our learning goals for today are basically, if I want to sum them up, first, what is gender studies, what are gender theories and certain key aspects of that like performativity and queer studies, and then also some applications of those theories in US culture. At one hand, what happens there at the moment with regard to gender identity and ideology, and also what is intersectionality and what happens if we assume that gender identity is not only gender but also linked to race and ethnicity. So basically, for example, Black womanhood, and that's basically the key topic we are going to look at. Keywords for this session are those. I personally want to add some more because I think these concepts are pretty important when we're talking about gender studies and sex and sexuality, for they will just pop up on your academic journey in that area a lot. Now, let's just delve head on into the topic, the basics of gender studies, terminology, and concepts. First, okay, what is all this about? We can say that gender studies departs from the study of the division of humans into men and women. Here we have a binary distinction, so twofold, and also the problems that come with that. Because if gender studies does what it does, study the social and cultural aspects, logic, norms, representation, origins, and so on and so on, with regard to this binary distinction of men, women, we quite soon arrive at the conclusion that, well, actually, this binary is not quite sufficient because there are a lot of problems with that binary, and actually, it depends on the culture, it depends on quite a lot of aspects, and there are biological and philosophical findings that basically go against this binary gender distinction. So basically, gender studies exceeds this binary distinction a lot. I also named some prominent scholars in the field, starting with Judith Butler and then also a lot of other names. Those are, of course, not the only scholars working in the field of gender studies, but if you come across those names, then you can be quite sure that there is something along the line of genders on the agenda. And then certain subdisciplines and areas of gender studies would be feminism, masculinity studies, queer studies. And if we look at all that, we can say that gender studies is actually situated somewhere between activism, biology, and philosophy, because it takes both these disciplines, biology and philosophy, and in a way uses those theories to claim that, well, actually, this binary distinction, the problems that come with it, they're not natural, but we have something very cultural here and we can do something against that. So gender studies is also a lot about challenging existing distinctions and also empowerment in a way. So that's why I say somewhere near activism sometimes. But that also goes for cultural studies. If you remember that cultural studies is always political, so gender studies would be a very particular political aim here. Now, let's have a look at clear-cut distinctions that will in the end not turn out to be so clear-cut, but let's just begin at the beginning. In gender studies, we talk about gender versus sex. Sex would be the biological distinction of humans into different categories, sex categories, and it's based on bodily features. If we want to put it very straightforward, if a person has a penis, it's very likely to be assigned the male sex. If this person has a vulva and a vagina, it's very likely to be assumed as a female person. So this would be the basic distinction. We can also talk about hormones and other bodily features. And terms that we have are male, female, transsexual, intersex. So everything that has to do with bodily features. Gender, however, would be the social or cultural distinction linked to representation and behavior. So basically, what do we assume to be very typically feminine and masculine? Femininity, masculinity would be the terms here, also transgender, diverse, or non binary gender. And examples would be clothing, gestures, or body postures. So I guess you've heard about manspreading, for example. So the idea that men or people with a masculine gender claim a lot of space in public. Not everybody, of course, but it's very typical, stereotypical of masculine people that they claim a lot of space spread out in public, whereas femininity would be associated with making oneself smaller and not claiming so much space. So very typical gestures and body postures here. We have, of course, also roles and identities that basically overlap with sex and gender, like cis person, trans person, or queer. And also social roles like mother or father would be somewhere associated with sex, so basically with biological distinctions, but on the other hand, also with certain gender roles, so certain behaviors and representations. And sexuality would be relationship preferences and also, yeah, sexual life. So basically, this would be the, more saucy part, if we want to say it like that. Whereas sex and gender are really the identity part. The question here is it that straightforward? And well, if I ask like that, of course it's not. If you want to take some time, then maybe stop this video, go to the description, click on the link for the trailer of the Netflix series Hollywood, and think about what you see in that trailer along the lines of what can we say about sex, gender, and sexuality in this trailer along the lines of what we just talked about. If you did so, you will have found out that, well, yes, we can have this very nice distinction of sex and gender, but actually it's way more complex and way more difficult because you cannot simply disentangle sex and gender and sexuality. And some keywords or key terminologies and topics that I would like to raise here are, for example, neuroplasticity and also the question of the neutrality of science. They basically explain quite well why this is complicated. Neuroplasticity derives from brain research, and brain research is a major field in sex difference research. Basically, scientists trying to find out, okay, are there actually biological differences between men and women, and can we classify brains along this binary line? What they find is, yes, there are structural differences. What they also find, and that is very interesting to me, those differences are not just there, but they evolve through, for example, gendered behavior. So basically, this saying, neurons that fire wire. If you use your brain in a certain way, you will develop a certain brain structure according to the usage. It's like a muscle. If you use the muscle a lot, it develops into a certain direction. And this is what happens here. The brain can basically adapt to the usage situation. And if you all the time use your brain in a gendered way, along the lines of femininity, masculinity, of course, it will develop into a biologically different brain with regard to the way you use it. So that would be neuroplasticity. And also the question of how neutral is science actually? Yes, science tries to stick to the facts, but on the other hand, we do have prominent discourses. We do have the idea of this gender binary, and if you look for sex differences, then you basically look for that binary distinction. You're not looking at it in a neutral way. You're not looking at it in the sense of, okay, what material do we have? What could come from that? But rather, does this emphasize the existing distinction? So basically, you have something pre mediated in mind. And this also goes along the lines of confirmation bias. If you look for something certain, then you will find evidence for that because you just have a certain perspective. And this, in a way, challenges the idea that science is always neutral because we always have this pre knowledge. We always have those prominent discourses in science. So we can say that with regard to sex versus gender, both categories are connected because biology is connected to how you use your body, how you represent your body, how you live your life, how you behave, and thus culturally influenced. And also this perception of what is feminine, what is masculine, and how does sex in a way link to that? It's all in a way culturally determined. Gender is, however, neither constructivist nor essential. Constructivist would be it's completely deliberate. You can assume gender basically like from scratch, from nothing. There's nothing that determines something in a way. And that's not true because we have those predetermined meanings. So basically, there are some lines along which you can construct gender identities. So it's not just nothing as a basis, but there are certain bases, mainly also the body. But gender is also not essential, so it's not something fixed, something that is predetermined, but something that is actively constructed, however, with regard to a certain pre existing material, the body, and certain pre existing knowledge. And now, this is where new materialism proves as a quite useful concept, because basically, here we say that gender and sex are the culturally determined way humans make sense of their individual bodily features, and also the way, in a way, humans experience their bodies. So here we go back to structures of feeling, gender as structures of feelings, gender as culturally determined ways of making sense of the body in terms of how do I experience this body? How do I experience life in that body? How am I supposed to feel? What am I supposed to do with that body? This would be, yeah, something along the lines of new materialism. And new materialism, however, also claims that nature's possibilities, so the material of the body, would provide more than this binary. So that the binary distinction is like a framework that is used very often, actually hegemonic all the time. But there would be more possibilities if we were able to basically disentangle it from this binary framework. So that would be new materialism that shows quite concisely how gender and sex are connected. One other concept that is super important is gender performativity or gender as performance, a theory developed by Judith Butler in the 1990s with their book Gender Trouble. And here it's basically stated that gender is a repeated performance that becomes like second nature and constitutes those gender norms. So basically, at one hand, we have those norms that are pre existing, but they do not exist because they're just there, but they exist because we have this repeated performance and they are basically dynamically constituted. We can say that gender norms are a work in progress. They change according to what people do at a certain point of time with regard to gender identities, how they behave, how they perform, and also how they stylize their body, which clothes, which behaviors, which expressions are assumed to be related to certain genders. So basically, we have this regulatory framework, this idea of what does it mean to be masculine, feminine, what does it mean to have a certain gender? But on the other hand, this framework is always in progress. It's always reconstructed and relived through this performance. So we have, at one hand, the basis, ideal scripts, gender norms. They are at the same time the product of this performance, so it's interlinked. And what gender performativity also does, very importantly, is it criticizes gender identity essentialism. So, this idea that it's something fixed, just because of this dynamic quality, because it's always in progress. Um, One very important concept. Another very important concept is queer versus queer. Queer, at one hand, as a sexual orientation in the LGBTQ community, it would be one meaning. And then the other meaning is queer in the sense of queer studies. This is actually quite radical because it challenges any kind of existing identity category and structures. It's less about describing something as queer in the sense of different, but rather about queering in the sense of a verb, in the sense of challenging everything by describing it as queer, in the sense of, yeah, really going against those existing structures and looking behind the binary distinction, but also behind any kind of fixed identities, just to really say that look at the limitless possibilities. So that would be queer and queer studies, really going just much further than queer as a sexual orientation. Another important concept is intersectionality. This is claiming that gender and sex are influenced by other identities. So, for example, gender and sex overlap with race and ethnicity and class. So, the experience of a black woman versus a white woman would be completely different because of this overlap of ethnicity or race with gender and sexuality. Because gender is lived, performed, and experienced differently, just according to those overlapping identities. This is just really a very short, okay, what is intersectionality? And I could, of course, go much more deeply into that. But because of time reasons, I really try to limit myself here. But if you want to look it up, just Google it and really go for it because it's very interesting. Another important concept is heteronormativity. This assumes heterosexuality as a norm in society, and this is, of course, linked to the gender binary of man versus woman, because if we wouldn't have those binary distinctions, we wouldn't have the hetero person to have heterosexuality. And now this claims that heterosexuality is not just a norm in the sense of this is what everybody does, but this is basically the prism through which we see all kinds of relationships, all kinds of romantic relationships, all kinds of couple relationships. For example, the question of who's the man in the relationship, this is not a question that you would direct to a couple where you have a man and a woman. It is a question that raises or is raised with regard to same sex couples. So basically, the idea of, okay, yes, you are a same sex couple, but or a couple that doesn't identify as man woman, but there must be a man in the relationship because it's the normative idea of a heterosexual model as model for everything, and also the expectations in society. It is assumed to be normal that people, well, have children and assume, so this would be a very conventionalized and traditional view, of course. And I personally would not say it's normal to just lead a heterosexual life, but this is basically the general tendency in society, that this is the norm and everything else is seen through that prism and basically described as deviant or different from that. So this is the main strand, it's like the main road in society. This is why it's also so dangerous, because it is in a way limiting the possibilities of representation for everything else. Now, with all these theories, maybe take a second look at the video or the trailer of Hollywood and try to link what you see there to all these aspects. You can, of course, take your time for that and also find different examples, because once you try to map out, okay, what does heteronormativity mean in that context? How does intersectionality feature here? How is gender performed? You will find endless arrays of examples, because it's just like so much linked to everyday life. If we want to conclude, though, we have, with respect to the basics of gender and gender studies, terminology and concepts, this basic terminology, sex, gender, sexuality, and then also the complexities that come from the overlappings of biology and culture of different identities. Then also concepts like performativity, so gender as a performative act that actively produces and also subverts gender scripts. Gender basically as a discourse is something dynamic. And then the other key concepts that we basically just talked about. Now, this was very theory heavy. And on the next slides, I will give you some basically material to work with, some thoughts, some examples where you can apply what we just talked about. And we'll start with, well, what President Trump himself does at the moment in the White House. Basically, as example, this presidential action, quote, defending women from gender ideology, extremism, and restoring biological truth to the federal government. Okay. So basically, here we are talking about biological truth, and we have a lot of claims in that article. You can just have a look at it under that link. I will put all the links into the description of the video so that you can access them easily. So basically, okay, what is claimed here? What actions are taken? And if we look at that and look at it with the perspectives we just talked about, we can see that this is very much a conventionalized view, and also a certain idea of, we deny certain people the access to representation because we claim that there is only man and women. There might be lesbian and gay couples, but nothing else really. So basically, you're really robbing people of empowerment, robbing people of, yeah, representation of their identities if they do not identify as man or woman, for example. So this is basically a quite big step into a certain direction. And with gender studies, we can really analyze that with regard to biology, with regard to philosophy, with regard to different aspects, and have a certain really analytical and criticizing look on aspects like that. Another action that President Trump took was language change, or actively banning words, actually. And the ground report that where I found the complete list, because actually it is an article by the New York Times, but you can't access it if you're on the free tiers. So basically, I looked it up and found this list, and there's the same list, and I'm like, okay, this means everybody can access it. Why not just use this link here? Um, and basically, what you can see here, that yes, there are a lot of words that are not related to gender identity, but there are also quite a lot of words related to gender identity, like diversity and different identities, and basically actively robbing a language or trying to limit the use of certain words. This is very dangerous, because in a way it limits the possibilities of representation. If I can't talk about something because the word is forbidden, if we take it to the very extreme, then I can't represent a certain aspect anymore. So this is also a very radical step, a very radical shift in a way, that in a way limits empowerment and limits representation for a lot of people. And then we basically make a cut with regard to contemporary US culture, with regard to what Trump does here, and go to intersectionality and Black feminism. And one author that is very important here is Bell Hooks. And yeah, she is actually dead by now because she died 4 years ago. But she wrote very actively on Black womanhood and yeah, Black femininity, and also how it is represented in popular culture, how empowerment happens. And I give you this quote from one of her books here, which basically is a lot about the representation of black or female or black femininity and sexuality, black sexuality in popular culture. And what we I mean, you can take your time, stop the video, and stop me talking and read through the quote yourself. But I just don't want to read out the whole quote because it would take too much time. What we can see here is basically that we have certain tropes, certain symbols, certain so-called iconographies. For example, the black butt, as something that is very much associated with black sexuality and stems from a time where this was very much represented along the lines of white Western viewpoints. So basically, black sexuality, the black butt, is a symbol of inferiority. And now, what Hooks claims here is that actually, in popular culture, those symbols, those tropes are turned around because they're used by people from this community to represent themselves, to basically use symbols, use tropes that were formerly used to oppress people, to limit people, to make people portray them as inferior, use them as a symbol of empowerment. And with that thought, I would like to go to the previous to last slide, where we have two videos. Basically, you can have a look at those videos because I'll give you the link in the description again. Two videos by African American artists that use this trope of the black butt and the idea of black sexuality, black womanhood, and use those very stereotypical and also previously oppressing tropes to represent themselves in the sense of empowerment, to use black sexuality as a very empowering trope here. And yeah, just have a look at those videos, think about the quote that I gave you, think about what we talked about today, and try to link, okay, how does this link certain experiences of a certain body to gender and sexuality, to popular culture, and how does this also function as a political statement? And with that, I would like to conclude. So basically, from this application section, we can take that at present we do have a huge backlash of the US government against LGBTQ plus ideology. We can talk about the role that language use assumes there, and also, yes, of course, Trump talks about it with regards of the empowerment of biological truth, but actually, that's a limitation. That's a limitation of representation for a lot of people. And then we had the topic of popular music as a site of discussion where iconographies like the black butt are used as empowerment. Basically, a question that we can ask is who uses the trope, in this case of the black butt, to signify what? Is it used from a white Western perspective to oppress people, to make them inferior, or are they used by people from this black community to represent themselves and show, well, actually, we use your symbols and use them against you because we use them for us instead of against us? So, with that statement, I want to say thank you for watching, and I'm very happy that my voice basically carried through that whole video until now because it is not at its best at the moment, I must admit. So, if you have any questions, drop me a message. And apart from that, I hope that you enjoyed the video and could take something away with you.